Let's see if I can tie all of this together. What you wear and what you buy and what you consume make up this image of who you are. They speak a language, whether you like it or not. I always find that very interesting because there's car people where, you know, somebody's just like, oh yeah, I drive a Nissan, and you just, you know, all vehicles have some type of connotation to us car people. For me, because I'm a closeted car weirdo, I always want to know what you drive, because whatever that is, there's a whole slew of like stereotypes, or if nothing else, just like assumptions, just based on what you drive. And some people are like that with shoes or clothing in general, right? And all of these things that we consume, whether we know it or not, they're speaking a language to some people. Because our culture is one of consumption and of buying things, and so a lot of the ways that we can define ourselves is by what we consume, what we watch, and what we eat, what team we cheer for, right? These are things that people use to add on to their personality. You know, you get into fights over like TV shows and stuff, and it's because it's not just entertainment, it's identity. And this is across all facets of existing, but certain people hone in on different things. Okay. I said, let's see if we can tie this all together. Here's my stretch of what we're actually talking about is music production is also a language in and of itself. And I don't mean mixing is an art form. It is. But what I mean is that you send out a particular message based on what your music sounds like. Good production can make or break a death metal album, and I don't mean it in the way you think it means. I mean, if it sounds too polished, you're not going to have the audience that you want. Because the real, if you're playing caveman stupid death metal, you don't want it to be super polished because they're not going to like it. You want it to sound kind of gnarly and shitty because that's your audience. And if you make something that's way too polished and way too nice, you're going to get metalcore kids listening to it and being like, what the hell is this? Why doesn't this have riffs? The example I used in the last video is that if you played Gent with Metallica's production, it would not be music, right? These rules apply to a lot of things. And if you aren't consciously aware of it, then your producer is. Like if you're going to a recording studio to make an album, your engineer has these types of things in mind. They are thinking about the language that you're going to be speaking via production, how the drums sound, how the guitars sound, all these things, because many genres could not exist without specific production that goes alongside it. Or at very least, they would be very bad and shitty and confusing, because what you're writing has to go hand in hand with how it's being recorded and produced. And that's interesting because that's its own language aside from musical content. If you stripped all the production away from it, or I guess it's the opposite, we're stripping musical contents, the arrangements of the notes and stuff like that away from what we're talking about. It's just production as its own means of communicating something, composition aside. And I've said before in another video, you know, you hear a band that just does one note of a ring out and you can already tell what genre it is. And that's because of the production, right? That's because like you hear an open ring out with just like the drums just go, just kicking cymbals and just open guitar chord. And you know, because of the amp tones, because of the way the kick sounds, all these different things, you're going to know what genre it is, or you should, or if you're a weird nerd like me, you would. And largely you can't mix and match. I mean, there are some interesting results when you do. There's this band called Havoc. This album, Time Is Up. To me, to my ears, it sounds like a Melodeath production of a thrash album, and that's one of the reasons I like it so much, and maybe that is the case. But for example, if Rammstein had Clayton's production, it would be shit garbage. And we're just talking about in the realm of industrial metal, right? That's another thing I didn't mention. Design Abstract isn't industrial metal. It never has been. Because the riffs aren't that. Anyway, so Clayton's sound, right? He's not trying to humanize the drums at all. The drums sound fake, and if they're real, they're fake. They're robotic and fucking blown out, and it doesn't sound playable. Even though it's not even hard, it doesn't sound played. The guitars, for the most part, sound pretty normal, and then the vocal layers are just like completely bonkers bad shit. There's so much shit going on there, all these like modulation effects and vocoder and layering and hard tuning and all this stuff, right? And if those things were applied to Rammstein, you know, you keep the guitars more or less the same. Well, the guitars would sound worse, but you know, but with those like sampled robotic drums and with like Till having like 17 layers of vocals, like that would sound like shit. Honestly, it would. At best, it would be significantly worse. It wouldn't be. I think their songwriting has some merit, that it wouldn't be completely out the window, but like it would kind of be ass, right? Because what makes Rammstein so interesting is that it's like, oh yeah, like the drums and the writing, the guitar playing, it all does sound very industrial, very robotic. But it's not because they're layering synth in there. They're not. That's their playing, right? That's their drummer, and that's RZK just like being themselves. They've even said like their drummer is, they just call him a robot because he is. But to me, that is way more interesting, because there are human imperfections in the playing, but it still sounds mechanical just because he's like that. And if you took that away and you used different production, even if you used metalcore production on a Rammstein album, it would sound like fucking ass, because that playing, that production emphasizes that playing. It's not overproduced. Like, it is very sheen and shiny and nice, but like it's not quantized to the grid or anything like that. Like it's still real, just like as one random example. And you can mix and match that way easier. You know, you produce a death metal album that sounds like black metal, it's not going to be as good as it could have been, because death metal needs to have that chunky, overly distorted and fuzzy tone that like you can kind of get away with it, but like also the drums drive death metal, right? It needs to be big and thumpy and huge. And if you use black metal production with all the really weak, shrill like drum sounds, that's not to say it hasn't been done, but it would be worse, because they sound like that for a reason, because the production emphasizes the genre at hand, and it is its own language. And to be sure, if we used more modern production for the Design Abstract, I'm sure it would sound better. Like, to the average person just listening to it with the super massive, blown out, turbo scooped, everything's all like plasticky and whatever, it would be received better, no question. And I think it might even open up the audience slightly more. But the composition would be lost, in my opinion, even if it would be the same, because like the strings would all be the same. But it's a voice. It's a creative decision to have the production be like this, to harken back to like 2000s Melodeath as I drive home constantly. And then all kind of art criticism and philosophy entirely aside, we also just can't afford it. I do it so it's free. If you want to mix it for free and you think you can do better, fucking do it. Go for it. We're doing this because we don't have a choice. We're not paying money when it's good enough. But yeah, even if you did take on that project, my point is those decisions that you would make to make the drums way more huge and super, like, I don't know, like every time I hear like modern metal production, the drums just sound like you're just listening to like drum music, and it all sounds like very scooped and very plasticky, and like I don't know, man, it's weird. I'm just old. It would be a choice, right? And listening to that, then you would hear it and you would go, you have associations with it, right? There would be assumptions that you would make if you're a production nerd like me, the same as when I see someone driving a specific vehicle and I just make assumptions, which is to say they could be entirely unfounded. Some people, they just drive a Mazda because they don't have any other options, right? How am I supposed to know that? I just assume if they're driving a Mazda, they're, and it's kind of the same with production, right? Like with us, we don't have a lot of other options, and I do my best to steer it in a way, to navigate it in a way that is how I want it to be. But I'm not under any disillusion that like the music couldn't improve from where it is. I know the mixes could be a lot better, and it'd be super cool if they're a lot better, but still were produced like 2000s or probably closer to 2010 Melodeath. Were there any good 2010 Melodeath albums? Probably. Fiction was, no, that was 2009. Maybe. Probably. I guess Atoma was good. All right, I'm rambling. I guess that's it. Wait, no, I have way more fun examples. Imagine if Clayton was produced like 90s black metal was. that would be unlistenable. IMO. I don't want to say like unquestionably that the production sort of locks in the fate of the music. Obviously there are variables there, and not everything is contingent on the production. However, it's a normally invisible thing that does a lot more than I think people think that it does. And it's also an interesting marker of like, a few years ago I was like, well, it was probably pretty recently, Disciples of the Void sounds like ass. We're going to remaster it, and it's going to sound a lot better. And then I tried, and I was like, this is better, but it's worse in that it's better. Because it was a product of the time. And making it sound better made it sound worse, because it didn't sound like itself anymore. It was naive, stupid death metal, and even though the mastering is god-awful and everything's kind of shitty, that is what that album is. And at the time, maybe it would have been better if it was better production. But it is a voice, and that was the voice at the time. And you probably know me enough to know that I never let people get away with yeah, we just do whatever we feel, man. Because like, anytime someone says that, whatever they're talking about can be quantified if you know enough about what you're talking about. That was always a pet peeve of mine for vocalists. They're just like, yeah, I don't really know, man. I just kind of get up there and do whatever. And it's just, okay, well, whatever is a quantifiable vocal technique, and I'll tell you what you're doing even if you don't know. Just because you're ignorant doesn't mean it's some unimaginable process that you're creating, right? It's a thing that's replicatable, and just because you don't know what it is doesn't make it esoteric and magical, okay? And it's kind of the same with like a full band. If they're like, no, like we don't try to play to a specific genre, or we just do whatever. It's okay. Well, if it's not prescriptive, it's still descriptive, and the engineer who has to deal with you still has to make that call. He might even not tell you. Hell, he might not even be doing it consciously, but he is making those choices. Because unless you produce an album completely blind, where you're just like, I don't want any reference tracks, I don't want any demos, I literally have never heard what you guys sound like. I don't even have a vibe. I don't even know your band name, because that would be it too, right? Is like, if it's like the somethings, it's probably going to be like punk. All that aside, just some random people show up, and no presumptions whatsoever. You can't even see what they're wearing for some reason. The producer's blind. I don't know. You just make sounds without knowing the genre or anything about the genre. You see how far back I have to trace, because anything is like, random band knocks on the studio door and shows up. You look at them, immediately you're gauging what they're playing, right? Just from how they look, from how they dress, the type of gear that they have. These are all things that would hint to what music they're making, not to mention the music itself. And then when you hear a demo and you see what they're going for and you hear the genre, these are all things that shape how the production will affect the music. It should be layered into every facet, because that's how I approach stuff. Is every single component that you possibly have control over, from the visuals of like the album art to the way people dress in photo shoots, and that with the vocals are delivered, all the production, all that shit should all be pointing in the same direction. Because it's all one thing. And that's the producer's job, is to take that and be like, okay, this is how we do that. And the means to that end is the drums are going to sound this particular way. You're playing something that's really chunky and really groovy. Probably that kick drum isn't going to be all click. It's also going to have a lot of thump to it. Whereas if you're playing like turbo blasty, like blackened death metal, where it's all just like, it's like super fucking fast with like those like proper alternate blasts, probably you're not going to have a thumpy kick. Probably it's going to be a lot more like clicky and way up high in that sort of black metal way, how like everything is in the high mids, like literally everything, including the bass. Because that better emphasizes that. You couldn't have like a rock and roll Breaking Benjamin kick sound in like a Dark Funeral record, because it would just be because it would be all low end, because Dominator or whatever that dude's name is a fucking machine, and you would just be hearing, it would just be like a low frequency. It would just be nothing. Millions of little decisions like that all add up to the final product, is my point. It's intentional, or it should be intentional, because all of these little things tell a story. They speak a language. They're all hinting towards the final product, right? And what I'm always thinking of is, if you can control it, control it. There's no point in having these decisions made arbitrarily. And I feel like that's sort of the worst aspect of like the local band syndrome. Like bands that, even if they've got like a hell of a following, way more than mine, they don't feel like the product of like a label or something in the industry, because so many of the decisions are arbitrary, especially ones to do with the aesthetic. You've got like, okay, here's the band logo, and like they play thrash, but you wouldn't know because it's a deathcore logo, because nobody who commissioned that logo speaks that language of logo design. And then like you go on their Facebook and it's just like a fucking purple Godzilla, because like a friend of theirs makes tattoos and just commissioned that, and it's like, okay, cool. And then you listen to the songs and it's like, oh, these ones sound distinctly different than these ones. Oh yeah, well, like our bassist wrote those ones. And and I give them the same look that when I said, oh yeah, they drove a Nissan. It's just like, someone needs to take control, and someone needs to start saying no to these fucking people. That's how I feel. At least if you want it to get past that aesthetic, or if that's what you want, if you want to feel like a grassroots local band and that like nothing's ever put together, then sure, then go for it. But this is always what I see. This is always what I'm thinking of. This is like every single choice that you're making, it says something whether you think so or not. And And that's the point. All of like the product is not just the product, it's all of these things surrounding it that make it what it is, including production and including stupid things like what band shirts you wear in your photo shoot, which I'm one to talk. I'm wearing my own fucking band merch, but anyway.